The wind that morning came sideways. It hit the truck before Jake even saw it, a white wall rolling off the ridge, swallowing the road in seconds. He'd driven this stretch of mountain highway 100 times. He knew its moods, but this storm felt different, angrier, like it had been waiting. He almost didn't stop. That's the part that still gets him, even now. He almost kept driving, but something at the base of the rock face caught his eye. A small shape, half buried, pressed against the stone like it was trying to disappear into it. His first thought was a rabbit. Maybe a bird that had come down wrong in the wind. He pulled over anyway. Photographer's instinct, probably. You stop for things that don't quite fit. He stepped out into the cold, and immediately the storm swallowed the sound of his truck door closing. He crouched down in the snow, and two small eyes stared back at him. They were barely open, crusted at the edges with frost, just a thin line of amber showing through. The animal underneath them was so small Jake thought for a moment it was a toy, something a child had dropped and forgotten, but then it moved. One tiny trembling motion, like a breath that almost didn't make it. A kitten, alone, high on a mountain road, in the middle of a blizzard. Jake reached for it slowly, expecting it to flinch or scramble. It didn't, it just looked at him. That thin amber line watching him like it had already decided something. He picked it up with both hands. It weighed almost nothing. For the next 2 hours Jake drove with that animal tucked inside his jacket, against his chest. He didn't have a carrier, didn't have a blanket small enough. Just his own body heat and the rhythm of the road. Somewhere around the first hour he felt something change. The shivering slowed, the tiny heartbeat, which had been frantic and light, like a hummingbird trapped in a glass, began to settle into something steadier. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the kitten was asleep. Jake sat in the parked truck for a minute, just sat there, the storm hammering the windshield, that small warm weight rising and falling against his ribs. He couldn't remember the last time anything had fallen asleep trusting him like that. His house was modest, a 2-room cabin on the edge of a valley he'd chosen specifically because it sat far enough from town that nobody bothered him. There was gear everywhere, cameras, lenses, hiking equipment, maps pinned to walls, a life built around watching things from a distance. He cleared a corner near the wood stove and made something small and warm out of an old flannel shirt and a box he found in the hall closet. He warmed some milk, the wrong thing to do he'd later learn, and offered it anyway. The kitten drank carefully, cautiously, like it was deciding whether to trust the situation before committing to it. Jake watched it settle into the makeshift bed and thought, okay, a few days. Until the road's clear and I can get it to a shelter. That was the plan. By day 3 the plan had already come apart, not because of anything dramatic, just because the kitten had quietly, systematically inserted itself into every part of Jake's daily routine. It was there when he made coffee. There when he edited photos at the desk by the window. There when he laced up his boots. It didn't meow for attention the way he expected. It didn't cry or climb his leg. It simply appeared nearby and stayed, present without demanding, close without crowding. He named it Rocky, partly because of where he'd found it, partly because something about the way it moved, low and deliberate even as a tiny thing, reminded him of something built for rough terrain. But there were things that didn't fit. Rocky didn't make normal cat sounds. Instead of meowing, it produced a kind of high, short chirp, clipped and precise, like a bird crossed with something else entirely. Jake had been around enough cats in his life to know what they sounded like, and this wasn't it. Rocky also climbed differently. Not the casual, paw-over-paw scramble of a house cat. It scaled the side of Jake's bookshelf in one fluid motion, vertical, fast, completely silent, and sat at the top staring down with an expression Jake could only describe as evaluating. And the eyes. Even as a small animal, the eyes were unusual, wide-set, round in a way that felt almost exaggerated. When something moved outside the window, a branch, a bird, the shadow of a cloud, Rocky didn't look at it. Rocky locked onto it, completely still, not curious, focused. Jake told himself it was just a quirky cat. He was very wrong. The weeks passed. The storm gave way to the long, slow exhale of late winter, snow melting at the edges, mornings still cold but carrying something lighter. Rocky grew. Not alarmingly at first, just steadily, the way a plant grows when you're not watching it closely. Jake would look up from his work and think, was it always that big, and then shrug it off and go back to what he was doing. Visitors helped him see it more clearly. A neighbor came by in early spring to return a borrowed tool. He stepped inside, looked toward the corner where Rocky was sitting on top of the refrigerator watching him, and stopped walking entirely. "What," he said slowly, "is that?" Jake looked up. "That's Rocky." The man didn't move. "That's not a cat," Jake laughed. "He's a little big." "Yeah, Jake." The man's voice had gone flat and careful, the way people talk when they're not sure if they should move. "That is not a cat." Jake looked at Rocky. Rocky looked at the neighbor. The neighbor took one quiet step backward toward the door. A wildlife biologist passed through town that April, a woman Jake had met once at a conservation event the year before. He mentioned the animal. She asked to see it. She walked into the house, set her bag on the table, and turned toward Rocky. She didn't move for a long time. Rocky sat in the middle of the floor and stared back at her with those wide, round amber eyes, tail wrapped neatly around his feet, enormous and still and completely unbothered. The biologist crouched slowly, studied the face, the ear shape, the build, the coat, thick and layered in a way no domestic breed produces. She stood back up. She looked at Jake. Her voice was quiet. "Jake," she said, "that isn't a house cat." The giant nobody expected. She said the name like she was reading it from a field guide she hadn't opened in years. "Palace's cat." Jake repeated it back to her. It meant nothing to him. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. A wild cat from the mountains of Central Asia. Round face, dense layered coat, wide set eyes positioned unusually high and flat on the skull. An adaptation, she explained, for peering over rocks without exposing the body. Built low to the ground, stocky, powerful, one of the oldest wildcat lineages on the planet. Jake looked at the photograph, then he looked at Rocky. Then back at the photograph. Rocky yawned, a slow, enormous, indifferent yawn that showed every tooth in his head, and walked over to sit on Jake's foot. Everything clicked into place at once, the chirping instead of meowing, the vertical climbing. The way Rocky watched things, not with curiosity but with the flat, patient focus of an animal that hunts by stillness. The way he'd scaled that bookshelf in one silent motion, the way visitors made him go quiet and low and watchful, like something calculating distance. None of it was quirky behavior, all of it was instinct. Rocky had never been a house cat. He had been, from the very first moment Jake picked him up in the snow, a wild animal. He had simply been too small and too cold and too close to dying to act like one. Jake sat down on the couch. Rocky climbed up beside him and pressed his enormous side against Jake's ribs, the way he always did in the evenings, heavy, warm, completely trusting. Jake put a hand on his back. Neither of them moved for a long time. The biologist left a list of contacts, specialists, wildlife organizations, people who would know what to do next. She was kind about it, careful with her words, but the message underneath them was clear. Palace's cats did not belong in houses. They were not domesticated. They had never been domesticated. Thousands of years of wild mountain living were coded into every cell of the animal currently sleeping on Jake's couch, and no amount of warm flannel shirts and wood stove evenings was going to change that. Jake knew she was right. He folded the list and put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't call anyone, not yet. Life with Rocky that spring was, if Jake was being honest, genuinely funny. For all his wildness, for all the focused predator stillness and the silent vertical climbing, and the way he made grown adults back slowly toward exits, Rocky had developed a very specific list of fears and obsessions that made no sense whatsoever for an apex hunter. The vacuum cleaner, for instance. Jake had made the mistake of running it while Rocky was in the room. What followed was a blur, a streak of dense fur hitting the top of the refrigerator, a sound somewhere between a bark and a hiss, and then 20 minutes of Rocky sitting up there staring down at the vacuum with the expression of an animal deeply reconsidering all of its life choices. Jake laughed until his eyes watered. Rocky did not find it funny. There was also the laundry situation. Warm clothes fresh from the dryer had become in Rocky's mind a personal resource. Jake had learned to act fast or lose the entire load. He'd pulled a flannel shirt out once to find Rocky already arranged on top of the pile with the settled expression of someone who had been there for years and had no intention of leaving. And the camera equipment. Jake's camera bag sat on the table near the window where he worked. Rocky had decided early on that this bag was a rival. He'd circle it, sniff it, occasionally press one enormous paw on top of it with deliberate territorial weight, as if establishing something. Jake had tried moving the bag. Rocky had simply relocated his surveillance operation to wherever the bag went. It was impossible not to love him. That was the problem. The wildlife specialists Jake eventually spoke to were patient and clear. Rocky could not stay indoors indefinitely. Palaces, cats in captivity, even large, well-funded wildlife sanctuaries, rarely thrived the way they did in the wild. They needed territory, they needed to hunt, they needed cold open mountain space and the particular solitude of high-altitude terrain. More importantly, Rocky was young. He was at the age where instincts were sharpening fast. The window for a successful transition to the wild, if one was possible at all, given his unusual start, was narrowing. Jake listened to all of it, took notes, asked good questions, drove home and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. He started slowly, an outdoor enclosure first, large, covered, connected to the house through a door Rocky could operate himself once he learned the latch, which took him approximately 4 days. Jake would watch from the kitchen window as Rocky moved through it, low and deliberate, reading the wind, tracking birds passing overhead with that motionless, locked focus, then longer stretches outside, supervised at first, then not. Jake would hike out to the ridge in the evenings and find Rocky already there, sitting high on a flat rock, looking out over the valley below, not pacing, not restless, just still, the way the mountain itself was still, the dense coat moving slightly in the wind. The round amber eyes scanning the distance. One evening Jake stood back and watched him for a long time without saying anything. The tiny shivering thing he'd pulled from the snow, the almost weightless creature that had fallen asleep against his chest in a cold truck, was gone. In its place was something composed and powerful, and completely at home on the edge of a cliff in the fading light. Jake felt proud. He also felt, quietly and without wanting to, the first edge of something like grief. The overnight disappearances started in early summer. The first time Rocky didn't come back in the morning, Jake was up before dawn walking the perimeter of his property, calling out in the low voice Rocky had learned to respond to. Nothing. By midday he was fighting the urge to go out further. By evening Rocky was sitting on the porch as if he'd never left, eating from his bowl with complete calm, utterly unbothered by Jake's visible relief. It happened again, then again. The absences grew longer. One night, then 2, then 3. Jake tracked them on a calendar he kept on the kitchen wall, circling the days in pencil. He told himself it was good, it was right, it was exactly what was supposed to happen. He kept circling the days anyway. Then the rumors started. A rancher 2 valleys over mentioned a large cat he'd seen moving along the ridgeline at dusk. Someone posted a blurry photograph on a local community board, a shape in the shadows at the tree line, eyes catching a flashlight. People began talking. A few people began asking questions. And not everyone asking questions was doing it out of curiosity. Jake heard the word trap used once in a conversation he wasn't supposed to be part of. He started losing sleep. He sat with it for a long time, the thing he didn't want to think about directly. The fact that Rocky moving freely through the mountain meant Rocky moving through a world that didn't know what he was, that saw a large unknown animal and felt something other than wonder. Loving Rocky, Jake was beginning to understand, might eventually mean doing the thing that felt most like losing him. He was still sitting with that thought one morning, when he looked out the window and realized he hadn't seen Rocky in 5 days. He checked the calendar, checked it again. 5 days. He went outside and walked the property, called out, listened, wind, trees, nothing else. He stood at the edge of the tree line for a long time. Rocky was gone. The return of the beast. The first week Jake told himself it was normal. Rocky had disappeared before. 2 days, 3 days. It was part of the pattern now, part of what the specialist had said to expect. Independence wasn't a switch that flipped all at once. It came in stages, longer absences, then returns, then longer still. That was how it was supposed to go. He kept the food bowl filled anyway. Every morning he'd check it. Every evening he'd replace what hadn't been touched with something fresh. A small, quiet ritual that he didn't examine too closely because examining it meant admitting what it was, waiting. The second week was harder. Jake drove the mountain roads in the early mornings before the light fully came up, windows down, moving slowly, not searching exactly. He wouldn't let himself call it that, just driving, looking at the tree line the way you look at a door you're trying not to stare at. He shot very few photographs that week. When he did go out with his camera, it was mostly habit, the motions familiar enough to carry him through without requiring much thought. He'd stand at a ridge or a creek bed and look through the viewfinder and find he wasn't really seeing anything. His neighbor stopped by on a Thursday, took one look at Jake's face and didn't ask any questions, just came in, made coffee and sat at the kitchen table talking about nothing in particular for an hour. Jake was grateful for it. Rocky's blanket stayed where it was. It was an old wool thing, dark green, that had migrated over the months from the makeshift box by the wood stove to the corner of the couch where Rocky had eventually decided he preferred to sleep. Jake had washed it once, and Rocky had spent 2 days afterward sniffing it with deep suspicion, apparently offended by the change in smell, before finally accepting it back. Jake hadn't moved it. He told himself it was just where it lived, that there was no particular reason he straightened it some evenings when it had shifted during the day, that it didn't mean anything. He straightened it every night before he went to bed. Sometime in the 3rd week the guilt arrived. It came quietly, the way guilt usually does, not as a single thought, but as a slow accumulation of small ones. He replayed decisions he'd made over the past months, the timeline of Rocky's outdoor access, the pace of the transition, the nights he'd let himself feel relieved when Rocky came back, instead of reminding himself that coming back wasn't the goal. Maybe he'd done it wrong, moved too slowly, let the attachment go too deep. His own, he meant, not Rocky's. Rocky had always known what he was. Jake was the one who'd needed the longer adjustment period. Maybe he'd held on when he should have been learning to open his hands. He didn't know. That was the honest answer. He didn't know, and there was nobody who could tell him, and the not knowing sat in the house with him like its own kind of presence. Then the storm came. It rolled in on a Tuesday evening, the kind of system that announced itself hours in advance, the sky going that particular flat gray that mountain people learn to read. Jake boarded the side window that sometimes leaked, brought in extra wood, checked the truck. By midnight the wind was serious. By 2 in the morning the snow was coming hard enough that the porch light caught it sideways, a solid white curtain beyond the glass. Jake sat up late, not entirely sure why. He told himself he wasn't listening for anything specific. He heard it just after 3. A sound on the porch roof, heavy and precise, a single landing that came through the ceiling with a weight that no bird or branch could account for. Then a pause, then a sound he hadn't heard in 3 weeks, short, clipped, high and strange and completely unmistakable. Jake was at the door before he'd finished processing what he was doing. He opened it to the storm and the cold and the dark, and Rocky was standing on the porch railing, enormous. That was the first word Jake's mind produced, and it wasn't adequate. He'd known Rocky was growing. He'd watched it happen. But 3 weeks had passed, and whatever had happened out there on the mountain during those 3 weeks had finished something. The last softness of adolescence was gone. What stood on the railing in the snow and wind was an adult Pallas's cat in full winter coat, dense and layered and silver gray, the face broad and flat and ancient-looking, the amber eyes catching the light from inside the house and holding it. Rocky looked at him. Jake stood in the doorway in his socks and didn't say anything. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Rocky made the sound again, that short chirping call, and stepped down from the railing onto the porch boards, and walked forward, and pressed the top of his enormous head against Jake's hand the way he'd done 100 times before. Jake crouched down in the doorway. His throat was doing something complicated. He put both hands on Rocky's head, and Rocky pushed back against them, the same as always, heavy and deliberate, and completely certain. Jake became aware slowly that Rocky hadn't come alone. It happened at the edge of his vision first, a shape at the tree line, barely visible through the snow, then another, low to the ground, still. He stood slowly and looked out into the dark. 3 of them, maybe 4. Smaller than Rocky, younger clearly, arranged in a loose half-circle at the far edge of the porch light, not approaching, not fleeing, just watching, the way Rocky had watched things when he was small and learning what the world was. Jake understood immediately what he was looking at. He didn't move, kept his breathing slow, stood with his hands still resting on Rocky's back, and let the younger cats look at him the same way Rocky had looked at him once, from the snow beside a rock face, deciding whether this was something safe. Rocky turned and looked back at them. A brief, calm look, then turned back toward Jake. Something had changed out there on the mountain. Something had been built. Rocky hadn't just survived the weeks away. He had become, in whatever language wildcats use for such things, responsible for something. Leader, protector. The older one that the younger ones followed to the edge of the known world and then waited. Jake thought about the tiny animal he'd carried home in his jacket. He thought about the heartbeat he'd felt steadying against his chest on the drive down the mountain. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying better. In the weeks that followed, word reached Jake through the wildlife biologist, and then through others, that a developer had filed permits for a road expansion that would cut directly through the upper ridge. The same ridge Jake had watched Rocky stand on in the evening light, the same terrain where those smaller cats had been learning whatever Rocky was teaching them. Jake pulled out his camera for the first time in a month. He went back through everything he had. 2 years of photographs taken on those mountains, hundreds of images he'd never intended for any purpose beyond his own record of the place. Rocky appearing in many of them without ever being the subject, a shape in the background of a landscape shot, a shadow at the edge of a frame. He began making calls. The biologist connected him to a regional conservation group. The group connected him to a journalist. The journalist asked for the photographs and the story, and Jake told it plainly, without dramatizing it, the way he told most things. A wild Pallas's cat, raised from near death in a blizzard, returned to the mountain and was now living free with a small group of younger cats on terrain that was about to be disturbed. The story moved faster than he expected. Rocky appeared on a wildlife organization's website within 2 weeks. Not a close portrait. Jake didn't have many of those, and the ones he had he kept. Just a distant shot taken from the ridge one evening, Rocky's silhouette against the valley below, recognizable to anyone who'd seen him. Anonymous enough to protect him. The permit process slowed, then stalled. Jake didn't know how much of that was the story and how much was other pressures and how much was simply timing. He didn't take credit for it. He just told the truth about what was up there and let people who cared about such things do what they did with it. Then winter returned early. A severe system, the kind the weather services flagged days out with language they reserved for serious conditions. Jake prepared the way he always did, watched the sky, watched the ridge. Rocky had been visible 2 days before the storm, moving along the upper tree line with 2 of the younger cats trailing behind him. Jake had watched from a distance through his camera lens, not shooting, just watching. When the storm hit, he lost visibility entirely. It lasted 4 days. On the second day, Jake stood at the window and watched the white nothing beyond the glass and felt something he recognized from the 3rd week of Rocky's absence, that specific helplessness of caring about something that lived beyond the reach of your hands. On the 4th day, the snow eased toward evening. Jake put on his boots. He told himself he was just going to look. He stepped outside into the silence that follows heavy snow, that particular held-breath quiet where the world seems to be waiting to find out what's left. And he stood on the porch and looked up toward the ridge. And then he looked down, at the snow on the porch steps, at the tracks, large, round, deeply pressed, leading away from the house, back up toward the mountain. Jake crouched down and looked at them for a long time. Then he followed them, more than a rescue. The tracks led upward. Jake followed them through the fresh snow and the gray early evening light, moving carefully along the slope he'd hiked 100 times in better conditions. The storm had left everything clean and deep, knee-high in the low spots, the familiar landmarks altered, the mountain wearing a different face. He went slowly, watched his footing, kept his eyes on the trail of prints ahead of him. They were steady, purposeful. Not the erratic pattern of an animal in distress, no stumbling, no doubling back, no signs of the labored movement he'd been quietly dreading, just a clean direct line moving up through the trees toward the open ridge. Jake kept going. He found them in a shallow rock shelter about 40 minutes up. Not a cave exactly, more a deep overhang where 2 large boulders leaned together against the hillside, creating a pocket of relative stillness out of the wind. The snow in front of it was pressed down and packed, the way snow gets when something has been resting in a place for a while. Rocky was there, lying at the outer edge of the shelter, facing outward, not sleeping, alert, watching the slope below with that familiar flat, steady attention. His coat was matted with snow at the edges, but his breathing was even, and his eyes were clear, and when Jake came into his line of sight, he didn't startle. He just looked at him, the same way he'd looked at him from the snow beside a rock face, years ago, quietly, taking him in, deciding. Behind Rocky, tucked back into the darker part of the shelter, were the younger cats. Jake counted them without moving closer. 4, pressed together in a compact group, some sleeping, one watching Jake with cautious round eyes over Rocky's shoulder. All of them alive, all of them whole. Jake stood in the snow and didn't move for a long time. The light was going, that soft flat mountain dusk that turns everything the same shade of blue-gray before dark. The wind had dropped to almost nothing in the aftermath of the storm, and the only sounds were his own breathing and the distant settling of snow falling from an overladen branch somewhere below. He thought about the drive down the mountain 2 winters ago, the small weight against his chest, the heartbeat he'd felt steadying under his hands. He thought about the flannel shirt, the wrong kind of milk, the vacuum cleaner and the laundry pile, and the camera bag that Rocky had waged a quiet territorial campaign against for the better part of a year. He thought about the calendar on the kitchen wall with its penciled circles, the untouched food bowl, the blanket he'd straightened every night. Rocky stood up slowly. He stretched, the long, unhurried, full-body stretch of an animal completely at ease, and walked forward through the snow to where Jake was standing. He stopped a few feet away, looked up at him with those wide amber eyes that had always seemed to be seeing slightly more than whatever was directly in front of them. Jake crouched down. He didn't reach out, just waited. Rocky stepped forward and pressed his head against Jake's hand the way he always had. Heavy and deliberate, certain. Jake kept his hand very still. Behind Rocky, one of the younger cats had moved to the edge of the shelter and was watching, not fleeing. Just watching, the ears forward, the body low, that particular quality of attention that Jake now recognized as the palace's cat way of engaging with something new. Careful, patient, deciding. Rocky didn't look back at them. He already knew they were there. Jake stayed until the light was nearly gone. He sat in the snow at the base of the rock shelf, and Rocky settled nearby, not touching, not performing anything, just present the way he'd always been present. The younger cats gradually relaxed back into their various arrangements behind him. One of them, the boldest, crept forward by slow increments over the course of 20 minutes until it was close enough that Jake could see the individual layers of its winter coat in the dim light. It didn't let him touch it. That was fine. That was exactly right. Jake sat with his back against the cold stone and watched the last of the daylight leave the ridge and felt something he didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly, not relief, though that was part of it, something quieter than both. The particular feeling of a thing having arrived at its right shape, like watching a long equation finally balance. He'd pulled something small and half dead from the snow and kept it warm and fed it and made room for it in a life that hadn't had much room for anything. And it had grown into exactly what it was always going to be. Not because of him, not in spite of him, just alongside him, the way real things grow, in their own direction, at their own pace, toward whatever they were made for. He hadn't rescued Rocky, not really. He'd just been there at the right moment, given the thing enough time and enough warmth to find its own way back to itself. The permit was formally rejected in early spring. Jake heard about it through the biologist, who called on a Tuesday morning with a brightness in her voice that he hadn't heard before. The conservation group had submitted the photographic documentation. A wildlife assessment had been commissioned. The presence of a small but viable Pallas's cat population on the ridge, rare enough in this part of the world to constitute a significant finding, had complicated the economics of the project considerably. The upper ridge would stay as it was. Jake thanked her and stood in the kitchen for a minute after he hung up, looking out the window at the snow still covering the upper slopes. Rocky was up there somewhere, moving through the mountain the way he'd been built to move through it, teaching the younger cats whatever it was they needed to learn, occupying exactly the terrain that would now remain uncut and ungraded and undisturbed. Jake made himself a cup of coffee and went to his desk and looked at the photographs he hadn't yet sorted from the past season. He worked quietly for the rest of the morning. The visits continued. Not often. Jake had stopped trying to predict them or look for patterns. Rocky came when Rocky came, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes longer. He'd appear at the edge of the property in the early morning or the last light of evening, moving along the familiar perimeter with that low, deliberate walk, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two of the younger cats trailing at a distance. He never came inside again. That chapter was over, and they both seemed to understand it the same way. But he'd stop. Every time, he'd stop somewhere at the edge of the yard and look toward the house, and Jake had learned to simply go outside and sit on the porch steps and let that be enough. No food bowl, no calling out. Just a man sitting on his steps in the early light, and a wild mountain cat standing at the tree line, and the quiet space between them that had been built out of 2 winters and a long education in what it meant to love something without trying to keep it. One evening in late summer, Jake hiked to the upper ridge. He went without his camera, a choice he was aware of making, deliberately, as he packed for the hike. Some things weren't for photographs, some things were just for being there. He sat on the flat rock where he'd watched Rocky stand in the fading light, years ago. The valley below was green and deep in the long summer evening. The air at that altitude had its own quality, thin and clean, carrying the smell of stone and distance. He didn't see Rocky. He hadn't expected to. He sat for a long time anyway, watching the light move across the valley, listening to the mountains settle into evening. A hawk worked the thermals far below. The shadows lengthened slowly across the ridgeline. Then, just as the last direct light left the upper rocks, he saw movement, far along the ridge, a shape, low and compact, moving through the boulders with that unmistakable deliberate quiet, stopping on a high point and going still, looking out over the valley. Jake watched. Rocky stood there for a long moment, strong and unhurried, fully occupying the space he stood in, the last light catching the dense gray coat. Then he turned his head, not toward Jake, or maybe toward Jake, it was hard to say at that distance, just a turn of the head, a brief pause. Then he moved on, dropping below the rock line, gone as quietly as he'd appeared. Jake stayed until it was fully dark. Then he stood up, brushed the dust from his jacket, and started back down the mountain. He was smiling, not at anything he could have easily explained to someone else, just at the whole improbable shape of it, the storm, the drive, the tiny heartbeat against his ribs, the vacuum cleaner, the camera bag, the penciled circles on a calendar, the tracks in fresh snow leading upward, all of it. The way a thing can come into your life half dead in a blizzard and leave it larger than you found it. Both of you. Rocky's story is based on the extraordinary reality of Pallas's cats, one of the world's most ancient and elusive wild cat species. If this story moved you, please consider supporting wildcat conservation efforts in your region. These animals are still out there, on ridges not so different from this one, living exactly the lives they were built for. Subscribe for more stories like this one.